Hello, good morning, Brian. Well, this year we have celebrated the 30th anniversary of the FPP Foundation with a series of interviews with relevant and emblematic members from the early days of the FPP. We have spoken with Miranda Voigtwang, Lydia Tischler, Dimitris Anastasopoulos, Effie Linus, and Rita Polonen. Others have not been in these interviews, but they are in the early days of the FPP, and we remember them with great fondness. John Tiantis, Serge Frisch, Birgit Hallerfors, Margareta Morner, Jan van de Sande, Rudolf Balmer, Julia Pestalozzi, Joyce Piper. Today, as the finishing touch to this series of interviews, I have the pleasure and the honor to interview Dr. Brian Martindale, the founder, first president, and now honorary president of the FPP. Thank you so much, Brian, for being here, for having agreed to share this space that aims to be of oral transmission, of a live memory of the history of the FPP that illuminates us in the present and on the way to continue building the future of the FPP. Thank you, Brian. Well, these interviews will remain in the FPP archive. And I highlight this because the archive is the latest, but I'm sure won't be the last of Brian Martindale's initiatives for the FPP. Brian, you have been the driving force of the FPP. With your creative, psychoanalytic, and organizational mind, with your leadership ability, your great work capacity, and with a deep commitment to psychoanalytic psychotherapy, you began placing the preliminary cornerstones of the FPP. And here is where I'd like to start. Before the founding of the FPP, I would be very interested to know how was the creative process in your mind of the foundation of an organization of this scope?
Oh, well, thank you, Maria, and it's a pleasure to be talking with you as one of the very early members yourself of the EFPP. I remember very well our meetings with you and Pilar in Madrid. Yeah.
Yes.
Well, when do things start? I suppose my interest in organizations started when I was working at the Castle Hospital, psychoanalytic therapeutic community in Southwest London during my training. And I got appointed in my last year there to be the community doctor. And that meant being interested in how the different parts of the community related to one another and the dynamics between the two. We had an adolescent department there, a family department, and a young people's department, and it was a residential therapeutic community. So that's where I began to realize that actually what went on in the larger scale of things was just as interesting as what happened in the consulting room. So that's where my organizational interest, I think, was awoken and shifted from, because I used to just love just being in the consulting room with my individual patients. I should say the other thing, I always liked working with families as well from the beginning, which I think is related. Anyway, to jump a little bit, we have in Britain an organization called the Association for Psychoanalytic Psychotherapy in the Health Service, which was founded a good decade, I think, before I became involved, by psychoanalysts who were mainly doctors, actually, doctors, psychoanalysts working in the health service initially. And that organization grew. And I got on the committee of that and was asked to be the chair of the conference committee. So I organized some conferences in the UK. And then I'm not sure quite why, but I had the idea of organizing a European conference to find out what was happening in other countries. And that was in 1988. We had a surprisingly well-attended meeting of 300 or so people with leaders in the field, actually, from Scandinavia and Germany and France and so on. And it opened my eyes, because, you know, in Britain, we can be rather splendid island, have a splendid island mentality and think we are the center of the universe and so on. But I learned, I think, and others learned a lot there, that there were things that we could learn from the way things were done elsewhere at an organizational level too. So I think, for instance, I became good friends with Kari Pulkkanen, who's a Finnish analyst who was a real whiz at organizations and helped the whole Finnish psychotherapy structure get on the map. And they have one of the most advanced psychotherapy services for the public in the world, I would think. Probably the number of people able to get long-term psychoanalytic psychotherapy is probably higher there than anywhere else. And also learned about the work of Anne-Marie Dürsen in Germany, in Berlin, because after the war, she did a very important piece of research that showed Germany is famous for its psychosomatic hospitals. And of course, hospitalization expensive. And she showed that if people had, I can't remember now, twice a week or psychotherapy for a certain length of time, it cut down enormously the need for hospital beds. And of course, in Germany, health is funded by insurance companies, and insurance companies were very, very interested. And from then on, I think the early 50s, Germany's had an excellent provision of psychoanalytic psychotherapy. So these kind of things intrigued me. Now, at the same time, the European Union was beginning to function in a new phase. It was going to be the freedom of movement of professionals. So that started to arouse anxiety, suspicion about what people's intentions were, whether it be the European Union itself was going to legislate in some way, or whether there was another organization started called the European Association of Psychotherapy, which, without going into too much detail, we weren't happy the way it was being run, and they were planning a certificate and so on, and they were trying to lean on Brussels and so on. So there seemed to be a need for a robust organization that looked after the field of psychoanalytic psychotherapy. So those were the idea. That's how things started to germinate in my mind, in a way. And I was appointed then, after the successful '88 conference, to be the European Secretary of the APP, which meant that I was formally had a link. My job was to link in, keep those links with Europe going, in a way. Shall I go on a bit more?
Well, how was the process of leading and sharing the idea with colleagues in UK and also in Europe?
Yeah. So I had the public sector in mind, and so the next step, once this idea had formed, we need an organization, was what form it should take. And from my working as a psychotherapist in the health sector, I knew that there were three important areas that psychoanalysis contributed to. And that was, we had group analytic psychotherapy, and we had child and adolescent psychoanalytic psychotherapy. So that was the next step, to make links with, in Britain, colleagues from the Association of Child Psychotherapy. Lydia Tischl I knew from my work at the Castle. She was also a child psychotherapist there. And somebody called Brian Boswood and Janet Boakes were from the Institute of Group Analysis. Yeah. So we met, supported by the APP, and Nick Temple was the chair of the APP at the time. And we started to meet and discuss things, and knew that these three strands were important. And I see from my correspondence that the idea of an organization that brought those three together was not in my mind for a while, until 1990, I think. And then we started to consult with Anton Oppolzer, who was don't know if many people may not know his name now, but he was very well known for his organizational skills, and he was chair or chief executive of the Tavistock at the time, in a way. So then we started, then the process you asked me to speak about was reaching out in a way to sort of feeling our way through to who would be like-minded colleagues in those three areas in the European Union. At that time, we were keeping ourselves to the European Union because that's where it was needed in a way. And so gradually I managed to make contact, and Lydia made contact with the equivalents in child and adolescent field in the different countries to see if they'd be interested. Maybe at this moment I say something about Institutes of Psychoanalysis, because this was quite central to my thinking. What I didn't want to do was to feel that we were setting up some rivalry to Institutes of Psychoanalysis. Mm-hmm. That was partly why the public sector was so important, to emphasize that we were doing something in applied psychoanalysis thinking. Not that people in Institute of Psychoanalysis don't do that, some of them, but their primary task is different. So I was trying to do something that didn't threaten that we were doing some watered down version of psychoanalysis. And so that was a very important strategic point, I think. And by and large, that worked well. We had support from many analysts and so on. It was, I think the French were still rather suspicious of us in a way. That was where the difficulty, some difficulties existed. And then we had the idea of a further meeting, of a delegates meeting. That's where the really hard work started, because having to put a constitution together. And I remember that took me enormous amount of time and thought to think about the constitution.
Because this foundation meeting was I mean, extremely important. What did that meeting mean to you? How did you experience it?
Well, the meeting was a result of a huge amount of work.
Yes, yeah.
And thinking and strategy. So the meeting was a culmination of these. The Constitution contained these two main pillars, I think, or three: public sector, these three strands with their own independent areas, so that we weren't competing against one another, child and adolescent and adult, and so they had their own equal area status. And then the other really big area was that membership would be via networks. And then there's the training standards issue, which we might come into a bit later in the talk.
Yes.
Yeah. So the meeting itself was a result of a huge amount of work. So it was a lot of anxiety, and that's why I wanted Anton to chair it, because we wanted to get, we wanted something concrete to come out of it. We wanted to constitute the Efpp. By the way, it had a different name at that time. We changed the name on the day. Okay, you might want to come back to that in a minute, what the different name was. So, and Anton was brilliant in the way of steering it through, not getting us caught up in minutiae, you know, and not allowing us to talk too much, because then the thing would start to unravel. But everybody felt really motivated, excited. We had about 60 people, I think, 60, maybe 60, 70 people came. So it was quite a well-attended meeting, especially in the conditions, which were, London was deep in snow at the time, which doesn't often happen these days. So there were transport issues, and it made a rather nice atmosphere in Regent's Park. Yeah.
Yes.
So,
I was there, and I remember that. You know, in a way, I was feeling that I didn't know very well what was going on there, but I really had the feeling that it was something important, and something important which was going to be meaningful in my life as professional, as it has been. It was very, very intense, indeed.
As you weren't supposed to know too much what was going on.
Yes. What was your vision and the first mission of the FPP then?
Well, I think in terms of the vision, as you know, our profession has got a reputation for endlessly squabbling about details of theory, technique, and so on. So I wanted to try and set up an organization that had enough common ground that we were outward looking. We weren't spending all that time looking in at the organization all the time, but it had a function to reach out and do something of what Freud was saying centuries ago about, this pure psychoanalysis be alloyed. It's like an alloy, the copper, he said, so that it would be a profession for the public. So that was what the APP was all about. So this was how to keep that going, momentum going in Europe at a time when there was perhaps, there was opportunities and threats. The freedom of movement of professionals, you see, and the Association of Child Psychotherapists already was the designated authority in Britain for if child psychotherapists wanted to come to UK, but they were already there, whereas adult psychotherapy and group psychotherapy was not regulated in any way. There's no mechanism in Europe for that. So there was, and in England, I know some people worried that where psychotherapy had developed, had been restricted to psychology and medicine, and we had a long reputation for being more widely open to other disciplines, different backgrounds, and so on. And I had this vision of what had happened in Finland too, which was a wonderful achievement of Kari Pulkkinen, a psychoanalyst relating on the Board of Health in Finland, bringing not only psychoanalysis together, but bringing together people with more behavioral orientation, group specialists, and getting them, putting their heads together in a way and getting an agreement that then led to legislation around psychotherapy in Finland, and the regions in Finland being able to provide psychotherapy to the population on a scale. So that was my sort of grand vision, if you see what I mean, that the kind of things happened in Finland would start to happen elsewhere, but it would only happen when people came together. Mm-hmm. The networks were so important. If you're going to lean on, if you're going to have an influence at higher levels, you need to be unified in the country. No government or Board of Health would be interested in speaking to a group that couldn't agree things amongst themselves. So that was the kind of vision I had.
Yes. And I wanted to ask you about the national networks. Where national networks were and are the cornerstones of the FPP. What was the rationale for national networks as a model of organization? You already said something, but I'd like you to enlarge.
Well, I mean, repeating myself somewhat, I mean, I suppose one of the things that really helped me know I was on the right track was getting invited to go and speak in Rome. I think I remember 3 or 4 years after the Efpp formed, where as a result of the Efpp, for the first time ever, the Milan this, the Rome this, the Turin that, the Venice that had a conference, bringing all the organizations together, and child psychotherapy. So one had a sort of feeling in a way that actually by coming together, Italy, which was quite impoverished in terms of psychotherapy in the public sector, might begin to get its act together in a way. And it was a very exciting time, feeling that it's by coming together, and with a sort of social intent in a way, with concern about society as a whole, that the FPP might, by listening to one another again, by listening to what's happening in different countries, we would learn from one another, which is how, of course, what happened right at the beginning, how much we learned from listening to what was happening in Holland and Denmark and Sweden in the field of psychosis and so on, from using psychoanalytic understanding. So the vision was learning from one another, and that networks were so crucial in terms of then taking the next level up. But of course, to form a network, you need to have quite a significant number of people. from different areas. And that's where I think the private sector is important in a way, because even in Britain, even though I did some training in the health service as psychotherapist, the depth training happened outside the health service, in the Institute of Psychoanalysis and so on. And the Castle too, of course, were important. So that mix, where I think the public sector will only be interested if there's been something going on separate that's grown and began to prove itself, and then you have people working in the health service who trained outside the private sector, who can then bring the ideas into the public sector.
Yeah. Well, and the private, contemplated private sector is fundamental, and in this sense to develop also the national networks in the private sector, because I mean, in many countries the psychoanalytic psychotherapy is still well not rooted in the public sector, and still there are so many psychoanalytic psychotherapists working in Europe. That is, if in the public sector it was very meaningful to develop the national networks around this, much more in the private sector.
And I sort of give credit to Lydia Tischler in a way, because to begin with, I was a bit wary about going too far outside the European Union, because I felt that we needed to build a solid foundation in the European Union first to get in terms of quality and things like that, to get our foundations right. And then we'd be in a better position to reach out to the European Union. Because if we went too quickly, I feared, to working outside the European Union, into the newly formed Eastern Central European countries outside the European, I thought we might have to, if they're to have a sense of belonging, I thought we might have to lower our standards too much in a way. That was my fear in a way. It's much better to get, but in fact, the opposite has happened in a way. And Lydia and many other colleagues have been going to Eastern countries to train, supervise and support. And in this way, almost to my surprise in a way, the good standards we've had for a basic organizational level have actually been very helpful in a way. They've not been too far out of the reach of people who are just getting going. So that's been very, very successful. But again, it's the private sector there that's developed, and it will take time, I think, before the private sector is strong enough and has enough people still working in the health service to begin to influence the public sector. And when I say public sector, I don't just mean, what we mean by public sector is different in every country. In Germany, for instance, private people providing services for the insurance companies.
But this is one of the strengths of the FPP, I think. The interrelationship also. These different areas, private, public insurances, in there, well, it seemed necessary to have, along with the national networks, the organization around the three different sections: adults, children, and adolescents groups. Over time, also couple and family section. It seemed necessary that to have these differences rather than just a vague conglomerate of psychoanalytic psychotherapists bunched together in a single group.
I agree.
Tell me a bit more how this came to your mind in terms of organizing this structure. Already you said something.
I think it's based on my experience in the United Kingdom, where I was working in the health service a large part of my week, working in a clinic which had a child department, and where we had group therapists and we were offering individuals. So it's sort of, you know, if you're offering a public service, those three areas seem to be terribly important. Yes, distinct areas, but relating to one another too. So in the adult department, we might see parents and so on of children who are being children and adolescents. We're seeing in the children and adolescent department, which is the same building. And I ran groups myself, not formally group trained. I had a fair bit of group supervision, but I ran groups for psychotic people with psychosis. I ran a group for people, elderly people, older than me, that means. Yeah, we had people up to in their mid-80s in the group that we went on for years, that group, an open group and so on, and same as the psychosis group. So I realized what an important part groups with an analytic mind in a way, how helpful these could be. And I think that one of the things I think there's maybe talk a bit about later when we think about the future is that I think one of the problems of many people who train in our field is that they haven't had experience outside the one-to-one setting. And so they get so familiar. We love our one-to-one setting, the couch or that we forget that actually there are other ways of applying our understandings that we gain from that setting. And I think people often don't get exposed to other theoretical frameworks too. It leads to the tendency to be very disparaging of others without actually really having explored other approaches and their usefulness or limitations and so on. So to go back to your question, it seemed, just from my experience, this was quite natural that these three areas, if we were talking about, we should be working together. And I'm really so pleased that the fourth section came in the end, because as my career has developed more and more, I've found that family work has absolutely changed my practice, especially working with the more disturbed people and the people with psychosis. So if I don't engage with the family at the beginning, I've got one hand behind my back, and finding a non-blaming, forming good relationships right at the very beginning with families, and then this has really transformed outcomes, actually. And that's been part of me putting this energy into this open dialogue book that I've co-edited recently, which is not strictly psychoanalytic, but a place, I think, for psychoanalysts to find themselves. And the other thing about it is how to create a structure in which we weren't competing with one another, so that you spend all your time arguing how many people should be on the board and all this kind of thing. That actually we could actually structure that helped us attend to our primary task, which is reaching out and developing. And I think that's been pretty successful, I think.
Yes. And together with the sections and in this structure, national network sections, the training standards of each of the sections, I think it was one of the fundamental keys to ensure the credibility of the FPP in the long term. What do you think about this?
Yes, I mean, I suppose this is where I felt always some anxiety in a way, some sort of tension in myself about setting standards, whose standards, UK standards or whatever, and things like that and so on. And but I wanted to have standards that held us together and didn't get us again arguing amongst one another. So my idea all along was that they were not to be written in stone, but they were more like a carrot in a way, a sort of way of aspirational thing for people starting up to work towards in a way. That these were some sort of almost ideal in a way, that because I mean, I remember being very impressed with the Swedish situation where without the FPP, they've been working for years to try and get psychoanalytic psychotherapy represented in the public sector. And after years of negotiating, they managed to get their training criteria, which weren't quite, I can't remember the differences now, but they weren't quite ours, and the ones that we had put down in our bylaws. So it was so important to respect that. So this aspirational rather than absolutely rigid, because if you develop a profession, you have to have boundaries, of course. What does it's got, but to be sort of flexible to a degree, in a way. I wouldn't have wanted to lose the Swedes in a way, but appreciate all that they'd done to get where they were. It was a tremendous achievement. So they were, just to repeat myself, they were aspirational and gave something the kind of things for people to aim at. And I think so. And certainly in the early days, I think we tended to, when people applied to be members and so on, to be, were they genuine in their, wanting to involve themselves for the best reasons in a way. And if they hadn't quite got there, I think we'd let them in. And I don't know how it is now. But then I think the observer status became important. The observer status became important. There's people who are sort of on the way.
Yeah. Yes, I think it's very good to the training standards for all the associations of the networks to, yes, as you say, as an aspirational and with these different kinds of membership. I think it's a spur for growth. Helped a lot of training, which was, spread all over to get a sense, a structure. Although, as you say, it's not written on stone, but an organized training program became very, very important. And the FPP, I think it has contributed a lot to this better training programs in each association.
And I think another thing I sort of sounds a bit simplistic in a way, but it's something I learned, the difference between principles and rules. So the principle is why, if we can keep talking about why we have to do this or don't do this or that, then thinking can happen. If you have a principle, then it's done for a reason. Where if it's a rule, people stop thinking, oh, we've got to do this or that, like only go 30 miles per hour, so to speak, in the speed limit with why. But if you think about why, then you can be a bit flexible. I'm going to go 33 or something. So I think this is very important. So keep talking about why do we have these things, and and discussing them in a way. So
and it is a continual issue in the nowadays. All the different sections are thinking on this.
But it would be the death of the FPP if they would spend all their time thinking about the boundaries. So the idea was to have something that was good enough in a way that enabled us to get on with other things too, as well as training.
Yes, sure. Well, let's go now to the delegates, main protagonists on the FPP stage. How did you envisage the role of the delegates then?
Well, as you know, we have 2 delegates from each section. And so keeping in mind that the membership of the FPP was through networks, or that if there were not networks, then the delegate's job, one of the tasks of the delegate, was to foster the establishment of networks. So, and that's quite an important task, or a very important task actually, in terms of fulfilling the primary objectives of the FPP is to support national networks happening in a way. So this was quite tricky because the EFPP came when we met at our conferences and our delegates meetings, they were very enjoyable meetings. People enjoyed meeting one another, and often in very nice places. We had conferences in Stockholm and Athens and Toledo. I remember very vividly. One of my wonderful memories is of on the terrace in Toledo after a hard day's conference, and so on. So the delegates became quite attracted to, and so it was how to keep them in touch with their task, you see, was on meeting, and have a sort of sense of, it isn't a job for life in a way, or it is a job. It is for life if you do your job in a way. Yes. back home. So I think one of the things that is perhaps continuing necessary is to to do what one can to make sure the delegates truly represent that they're not just somebody who shows an interest in traveling, but they actually have some influence or chosen by the networks in a way. So they have some, I hope that as time goes by, delegates will be more and more on the committee of the network, see what I mean, or the meeting place of the network. So they report back to two-way discussion, so they can involve their member organizations in networking, because you can't do it on your own in a way. So that's an ongoing task, I think. And sometimes Absolutely. I think the delegates got somewhat detached from home and too attached to the organization, the FPP in a way. So that's, and so I was thinking in the same way that, you see, I was the European Secretary, so that I had a formal role in the APP, and yes. which had a link with the BBC, and so I would do a newsletter we had an APP newsletter, and every 6 months or so I would do a full page on what was happening in the FPP, so that our members were informed. And at that time, we had plenty of British people coming to our conferences too, and so on. I mean, I was thinking, when I know you perhaps want to ask me a bit about further developments, at some point it might be useful to have a meeting that again is an organizational meeting where you invite the boards of the member organization, the member networks. It's not so much a clinically orientated conference, but a meeting where the delegates and the people who are involved in developing things locally, nationally, might meet together under an EFPP conference and learn from one another. And that I think we might support them taking more seriously than some do, maybe, the importance of choosing their delegate in a way. So delegates have a very important role, but it was wonderful people we met, as you know, Maria. It's been so nice to meet people, same people sometimes, in different places, and get to know people from different backgrounds and so on. And it was so. And the delegates meetings are always very hard work to prepare for, as you know, how to get the balance between reflection and action right, in a way.
Well, this is as I said, an ongoing issue, and we must, continuously feed in this role. And now, for example, in the present board, we decided to have, apart from the biennial delegates meeting, to have one annual Zoom meeting just for the issues of organizational issues.
Excellent. I
think it's important to have this space to to continue your ideas on the importance of the role of the delegates.
Do you remember once, I think maybe the second or third delegates meeting where we had at the BAP, British Association of Psychotherapy in North London. Do you remember we brought in an organizational consultant in a way from outside to help us in work groups and think and address some of these issues about primary tasks, what your objectives, short-term, long-term, and things like that, and so on.
It's a very important task. Well, the FPP also aimed to influence the public policy on regulating the practice of psychoanalytic psychotherapy. I know that at this moment you are writing about the development of the influence of the FPP in the regulation of the practice in the different countries, and you have fresh information.
Yeah, it's been very interesting to it's not just about the influence of the FPP, but it's what some things have happened outside the FPP, of course, and we haven't, but I think what I'm learning and just beginning to see this pattern I was referring to earlier is that where psychotherapy hardly existed, it's growing in the private sector, that an organization is starting to, somebody comes and visits and gets supports a local network, a local group forming, and then people want to train in one of the areas of the FPP. And I'm impressed with how much cross-fertilization there is between the countries. So people coming from one country to support the development in another. Some French-speaking couple and family therapists supporting that in certain countries, child therapists going to elsewhere, and so on. So at one level, that's one way in which green shoots are appearing in a way. At another level, where there's quite a substantial private psychotherapy going, what's beginning to happen is on the route to psychotherapy being an approved profession in a country, links with universities beginning to happen. Evidence base has become terribly important in the last 2 or 3 decades. Germany was ahead of the field in this respect. And it's remarkable to see how much that evidence base that I talked about from Berlin had a nationwide effect, as far as I can see. So there's these 3 different strands, I think: evidence base, university links, and it's very interesting to see how in university links there are certain theoretical aspects happening in university, but the private personal psychotherapy and supervision happening outside, but approved by. So how to find this creative ways of doing this in a way. One of the problems, of course, is that throughout Europe, one's personal therapy is almost always paid for by oneself. Not always the case, because there was certainly in Association of Child Psychotherapy in Britain, child psychotherapists who've been selected for training do get their personal therapy substantially paid for from the government in a way, because child psychotherapy is a recognized profession in the UK now. And I think the other thing that's so important, I think, is people are interested in economically in short-term therapies. The evidence base is not good yet for longer-term therapies. So we have to get involved in that. And I know from working as a psychiatrist after I retired from the health service, taking any kind of referral in a way, I think 20 or 30% of my people I saw really did benefit from 20 to 30 sessions in a way. They got back on their feet enough, got on their line. So we shouldn't, because we train in this intensive way, feel that's all that, that's what we apply to everybody who comes through our door. And if we do that, we won't get involved in the marketplace in a way for these shorter term therapies, which isn't to say that many people don't need longer term therapy, but we have to find a route, a way in a way. So I think that one of the things that's I haven't asked this in the question I've asked, but I think the thing it's missing in many trainings is a focus on research and research evidence. So that you'd be surprised how many psychotherapists actually don't know the evidence that's there, that psycholytic psychotherapy is as effective as these other approaches in many common disquiets that people have, that many people presenting with different problems, that psycholytic psychotherapy has its place in a way in the short term. So that's a way in, I think, to be able to talk with other disciplines and so on. But compared with 30 years ago, there's been a tremendous growth in our field. Some setbacks, some big setbacks. In the UK, we've had big setbacks, but beginning to find our feet again through this dynamic interpersonal therapy, is beginning to find a way back into these primary care psychotherapies, where we were getting shut down all over the country in a way. And I think the importance of attracting doctors into training is so important, because if you attract doctors into training, then they will be the trainers of psychiatrists. And if psychiatrists don't get any, and psychiatrists are powerful people in terms of determining health policies and what's available and so on. The government listens to psychiatrists. If psychiatrists aren't talking about psychotherapies, we're stuck. We're good. So I think, again, even though the private organizations need to reach out into and attract psychiatrists to train in the private sector, hopefully that they will take what they learn back into the field and the whole, getting a benign cycle going in a way. So on the whole, I'm very impressed in a way with what's happening, but there are some great learning points, I think, about what's gone wrong in certain countries. And that's, again, how to learn from one another. So I'm hoping the article will be helpful in from an organizational point of view.
I'm sure it will be. Yeah. Let's now move on the arena. John Tiantis was the first vice chairman of the Efpp since its foundation, and he contributed in various ways to the development of the Efpp. Most notably, he was the initiator of the section scientific conferences. Also, he hosted the 3 section conferences. I think that each conference, along with the delegates meeting, has been and it is the most, direct expression of the life of this organization. What can you tell us about the conferences?
Well, I'm separate out John from the conferences a bit, because John I had a lot of time for John. I thought he was a really creative person.
Yeah.
And in terms of reaching out, he was so able. He trained in adult psychotherapy in the UK, I think, but was a child psychiatrist. And he had a wonderful way of reaching into the European Union and getting through all the knots and raising money, for example, for the training of child psychotherapists in Greece. He was very clever, because it wasn't a child psychotherapy training as such he got the money for, but he chose a group of people for whom the European Union gave money. People, I can't remember, single mothers or unemployed people who became the patients or the children of these people became the patients of the child psychotherapist. So he was very clever, and he was always wheeling and dealing and in a very capable way. And he was very inspirational, and he was a great chap. We had a lot of fun together as well. From conference point of view, I remember him particularly for the Athens conference of child and adolescent psychotherapy. And although I didn't go, the Syros workshops were such an important part and so popular and so on. My memory of the conference is that everybody had their hand in organizing the conferences. I don't remember John especially, except the ones I mentioned. I mean, Luc Moison organized the first conference we had in De Haan in Belgium, which was on psychotic states.
Mm-hmm.
He did another one. And then there was the Athens conference of the Child and Adolescent section, which was a wonderful conference, which I'm sure John and Effie and Dimitris worked together on organizing. But he played a big part in the book series too, John.
Yes.
The monograph series. So he was a very talented man, and he was a real pleasure to have him as the vice chair, the first vice chair. Yeah. But you want me to talk a bit about the conferences, I think.
Yes.
Wait, were you? Yeah. Well, again, the conferences, I mean, everybody enjoyed the conferences, I think. And I think they were enjoyable because we kept time aside, plenty of time aside. After that, we obviously had some stars. We attracted Meltzer and people like that and so on to be speakers and so on. But I think the important point was the time for discussion. So we had relatively small groups, in a way, 20, 30 people meeting every morning after the talk. And that was, I think, very important and valued part of the conference, the time to talk and digest, exchange ideas and different approaches and so on. Sure. And we had a decent social side, of course, that everybody enjoyed. There was always a gala of some sort, and memorable places. So that was a drawing point for the Efpp, very important. And sometimes a book followed from the conference. Yes. Like the one I did on supervision that followed on the Toledo conference and so on. Yeah. I think probably we exhausted ourselves a bit at the beginning by organizing perhaps maybe more conferences than, it's a hell of a lot of work organizing a conference.
Then you had to slow down a bit.
Slow down a bit, yeah. We had to rein ourselves in.
Conferences. Also the monographs. At the beginning they were called monographs, and but I think that John's idea was to produce 2 monographs a year, and it was too much.
I must have turned a deaf ear to that one. Yeah, but certainly the monographs were, and we had a good relationship with Karnak to begin with, in a way that they were also income generating as well. Yeah. Now
we are with Routledge.
Routledge, but Karnak had been taken over by Routledge somewhat.
But it's going very well. Yeah.
Well, that's good to hear. Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah, so the conferences were very very important. But again, it depends on the delegates, you see. The important part of the delegates is to publicize the conferences. And I think we've got a little bit, as you know, after the Efpp, I got involved with another organization, the ISPS, and allowed you all to get on with it. And we didn't hear too much about the Efpp in Britain for a good while, and we're working on that at the moment with Hans-Jörg.
Yes. Now we'll be again more present.
Yeah, but it's an important part of the work of the delegates. It's not just to do with working with the higher part of it, but also with the members of organizations to really make sure the publicity gets out in good time, because for an international conference, people need to make arrangements a year in advance, and which is very different from a national event. Yeah,
sure. We are on that.
Yeah.
Let's come back a bit to the relationships with the psychoanalytic associations. How were, you already said something about this, but how were these relationships at the beginning, not only in the UK, but in the rest of Europe? Because, for example, in Spain, we had very tough times with the Psychoanalytic Association.
Yes.
But how was in general with the other countries?
On the whole, it was hasn't been a problem that I've been aware of too much, because I was very firm in making clear that we weren't trying to replicate psychoanalytic societies. And so I managed to, diplomatically, I suppose, but asking behind the scenes a bit, who were the, when we wanted to attract, analysts, we want to get their support. I would really make sure that was reaching out to analysts who were interested in the public sector, who were, and so on. Who was the Psychoanalytic Society in Britain was very supportive. They gave us some startup monies and so on. They support. Of course, many of the analysts in the APP were linked with the society, so there was a good relationship there between the APP and the British Psychoanalytic Society. So, in the people I were relating to in the Scandinavian countries, they were all analysts working in the public sector, in the psychosis field and so on, and so on. And that led to my links with the ISPS. And Leo de Nobel, who came to talk at one of our conferences from the Dutch Institute, he was in charge of a clinic in Amsterdam that was run by the Institute of Psychoanalysis for the public and so on. And he gave a very interesting paper, I think, on when the patient doesn't pay, because some people like to believe that if people are not paying, they can't benefit from, and that's nonsense. It's absolute nonsense. And he showed that in his work in the clinic in Amsterdam. So I feel it's gone well, and we had, I remember a few years into, we had Otto Kernberg over from the States, you see, to talk in Germany, and we had some very interesting conversations with him, behind the scenes about psychoanalytic politics and things like that, and so on. And he was very supportive and very helpful, and with all his organization experience. So, I know you had a big struggle in Spain, and it was quite difficult to work out what that was all about in some ways, but as if I think this sort of endemic suspicion that we psychoanalytic societies can have about people who are doing something.
Unfortunately, things now are very different, but at the beginning, yes, it.
So I suppose it's been a relief to me that on the whole, it's not been a problem. So for instance, you've got many of the Russian groups that are involved in the Efpp. Many of them are getting trained by the IPA and so on, and so on. It seems to be, I can't sense too much tension there. So that's been a source of relief and pleasure to me, actually, that,
Good. Well, at the birth of an organization and along the way, there are always moments of glory, but also conflicts. What are the best and the worst moments in these beginnings?
Good question. And of course, being, as we know, memory can be very selective. And false memory syndrome is alive and well. I think a really good memory for me at the beginning or early on was this meeting I've referred to in Rome, which I thought, these organizations had never met together in a way. And there were a very large number, 400 or 500, I think, people coming together with a wonderful atmosphere. And it was so, for me, it was very touching to be invited to, I can't remember, open the conference or say something or other and so on, and to be there and witness, in a way, my ideas actually being put into practice, that I maybe sort of can be quite convinced that I'd got these foundations, that hard work I did in the 2 years with my colleagues in Britain, from the other sections, that thinking, the strategic thinking, I got it right. We got it right, in a way. So that was very moving. From a pure pleasure point of view, as I I never forget that evening in Toledo. It was
Yes.
just wonderful sitting on a terrace after a day's meeting and that wonderful old ancient city, looking over Toledo.
Seeing Toledo, yeah.
Yeah, looking over the terrace with a nice glass of something or other, with the sun going down. It was that's just a memory I'll never forget. Absolutely beautiful, and after a successful day.
Indeed, yeah.
And in terms of positives, I think moment of pleasure and satisfaction for me was the Oxford conference, which was 10 years into. I think I'd stepped down as chair by that time, or had I stepped down as chair? No, that was handing over at that time, I think. And I think, first of all, the conference was a very successful one, bringing to with 300 or 400 people at least. But I think handing over and being able to leave, I think, and feel, because as I do more organizational work, the more I'm interested in generativity, thinking about the ending as we start almost. So I was so pleased to be able to hand over to Serge and the other members of the executive and really feel they'd got a solid executive group that I could step back with, pride, to be honest, and pleasure, and feel I'd left something really solid behind. That was very satisfying. And
yes. In that meeting in Oxford, you were named president, honorary president.
And there's the certificate on the wall behind me. Yeah. Pride of place. Yeah, yes. I'm very proud of that. And I was always a bit embarrassed about the word president because we're a bit in Britain.
Well, things change along the way. I don't know where and why.
Chairperson.
The chair to president. I don't know.
Yeah. Right. Well, anyway, there it is, written in words. Yeah. As for difficult moments, I think behind the scenes, there were one or two conferences where anxiety levels were extremely high about the preparations not being done in time, in a way. Publicity not getting out with huge risks to the organization from a financial point of view and so on. So that I can remember one or two conferences where this was the case. And it's so important to remember that an international conference is so different organizationally from a national one. Yeah. You really do have to get the publicity out so well in advance, and the publicity has to be good quality to attract people and to make their plans for traveling, often related to family work, anyone's family life and so on. So that's what comes to me at the moment. And certainly as I've been putting my literature together, looking at my letters and things like that, I can see that this was a big burden to carry for us on the executive at certain times. Yeah, I don't I don't remember anything any other worse times. I suppose. Mm-hmm. I mean, of course, I don't want to underestimate the amount of work involved, and this, and I had a very busy job and growing family and so on. So that getting that balance was always a tussle mm-hmm. to get that right. So. But I think the feeling that I'd got something right in a way, and could feel and as more and more people took on, cathected the Efpp, mm-hmm. I could relax more and more and more in a way. So that, I think the satisfaction mm-hmm. enabled me for the difficult areas to not be overwhelming in some way. Anyway, maybe after we've stopped talking, I'll remember some other headaches. But it's such a pleasure talking with you that it's revives. It keeps those things a bit of a distance.
Yeah, sure. You had one or two headaches more, yes, but this is very important to feel in satisfaction and see that things are going on.
Now you reminded me, Maria, of course. But they were interesting challenges coming to Spain at times when things went that. Now I think maybe you had that in mind in a way.
Yes, that was a big headache. Yeah.
Yes, that was a headache, but it was also. Yeah, and all credit to you for finding help. You and your colleagues are finding a way through and coming out the other end, and taking the problem really seriously, recognizing that something wasn't going right, and having to rethink things. So, yeah, and that was in some way the job, the organizational task in a way, was to support people in coming together, finding a way through, understanding the problem properly, not trying to solve it too quickly, but just trying to spell out what the problem was in a way.
And conflicts are parts of growth.
So absolutely.
To deal. Well, we already expressed during all this talk the good atmosphere of working, social and friendly.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Yes, which is still there now, a bit with some restrictions imposed by the pandemic, but how do you remember this emotional experience of the relationships between the founder members and the meetings with the delegates?
Well, I remember them with pleasure, because we always had a very good working relationship on the executive. People who have been very important and enjoyed that mix of work and leisure in a way. So that was very important, how to create a good atmosphere on the board and in the delegates meeting, to make them feel this was not just an organizational chore of having to come to wherever to meet, but actually there was something of substance to think about, meet with colleagues. I think learning is so important. Learning from what's happening elsewhere, reflecting what's going on back home and what's happening here, and so try to create an atmosphere of learning from one another. I think it's important. And I think having two delegates is important on the whole. People by and large got on well, was supportive of one another. That helped reduce the potential loneliness of being a sole delegate or being saddled with too much responsibility. So I remember with great pleasure the different levels of meetings, the executive, the delegates meeting, the conferences, and so on, and the growing, instead of having toilet paper coming out of my telephone in the form of faxes coming out, to the growing use of emails as a way of a different kind of contact, being able to readily keep in contact with people and so on, and of course now Zoom, like we're talking today on Zoom, and it's I'm a great fan of Zoom. Actually, I don't get Zoom fatigue too much, and I find it the quality of the Zoom is so good, and so I think it's opened up new doors, I think, and I think that will help the FPP enormously, being able to readily communicate with one another, and just even on an informal basis to arrange a Zoom meeting and so on. And I think that's got tremendous potential, I think, even though it's got its downside, but I think it's true. I mean, we've recently done a lecture up here that didn't take much organization. We had 300 people or so, and raised money for our local organization that was struggling financially and so on. So whereas if we'd had an in-house thing, it would have spent years of preparation and been very expensive for everybody. So I think it's got a tremendous, modern technology with all its downside has got a tremendous upside too in terms of what the FPP is all about.
Yes, sure.
Yeah.
Well, in this sense, how do you see the future of the Efpp?
Well, it was a pleasure to be invited to the celebrations and the delegates meeting earlier this year, and in spite of other aspects of the human condition at the moment, which I feel very down about, EFPP is, I think, in good hands, excellent hands with you at the helm, Maria. I'm a sailor, as you know, and helming the ship, and I feel everything, and the review I've been doing all points, I think, to things moving in a positive direction. Although I think I've already referred to certain things that we really need to grasp hold of if we're to have not be an island, not another Britain, an island,
yes.
An island group just speaking to itself in a way, which is important though that is. I think we do have so much we can contribute to the public good, I think, but have to go step by step. I think we need to evolve much more in prevention. You know, we know from listening to our patients and families how important development is, and adverse conditions and so on. I think we need to be much more active, psychoanalytic activists in helping the powers that be. So I think we have to think beyond the provision of psychoanalytic psychotherapy for all. I think that's almost too late, is what I mean. We need to do much more in prevention, I think.
Yes,
and
I totally agree.
Yeah. But how we do that is might be an interesting theme for a conference, actually.
Yes.
How do we get started, and how do we do more in the preventative field? I think, many of the things I think we've talked about are, as you say, work in ongoing progress, always will be, I think, supporting delegates, supporting the organizations to relate to take their delegates seriously and find a way in, so choosing and that kind of thing, I think, is really important, I think. And having that mix, I think, of having places to talk about one's clinical work, perhaps focusing on particular issues. I remember a very nice meeting we had with lots of presentation on refugees and so on, psychosis or other kinds of focusing on particular clinical areas, but also keeping alive the interesting people in organizational dynamics, I think, and how to grow an organization. I think those are things there's two sort of strands we need to keep going on at, and when's the right time for the EFPP to talk to other organizations? In the group section, you've got, I don't know how it is now, but you've got this, one of the strains of the group section was there was a very lively group analytic society called Egerton already, which had a how to cross-fertilize in a way that doesn't feel like treading on one another's toes. But so I think as in life, there's no shortage of things to be done or areas we can involve ourselves in. It's choosing where to focus at what particular point. What's the most urgent, like in our work, what's the most urgent anxiety to attend to at the moment, and how to make it a creative opportunity, as you talk about in the Spanish situation, where there was a lot of anxiety that needed to be understood, and had to go back to the drawing board, as you've done so creatively and successfully. And so sometimes need to take a step back.
Sure. Yes.
Yeah.
Well, we are approaching the end of this interview. Brian, would you repeat the same adventure? What would you do differently today if you founded the EFPP again?
I don't think I would do anything major differently. I mean,
But would you repeat?
I would definitely,
Yeah.
and some people have done things that I wouldn't have done, but actually they proved to be right, like Lydia's work, you see. I would have delayed that for a few years in a way, that reaching out, but she and colleagues put a lot of effort into reaching beyond the European Union. Mm-hmm. Maybe that was partly as the anxieties about European Union regulation faded. That was okay to do that, but I don't think I would do anything differently, but everybody's a bit different. And I think that's the other thing I'm doing, valuing those differences. That's not trying to prescribe something that's just one's own idea, but allowing other ideas to flourish mm-hmm. within certain boundaries, of course, in a way. Yeah, yeah. So different countries will do things in different ways. I think that wouldn't want to prescribe anything, but I feel I and colleagues have created a structure that allows differences to flourish to a certain extent without falling out with one another. Anyway, so I do the same thing again. I think, and it's a big area of my life where I've got minimal regrets in a way. Well, in fact, no regrets. No regrets come to the fore in a major way, and it's and as I say, it was such a pleasure to listen in on the delegates meeting, and with great pleasure. And wish Efpp well for the next 30 years, of course. Yeah, I'm sure it'll be there in 30 years' time.
Well, we'll try.
And that snowy day in London in 1991, of course, I had, will we survive till tomorrow?
Yeah. So Brian, the last one, an advice, please, from the first president to the last one.
Well, I remember Tom Main giving a talk at a conference and saying, when somebody a bit younger than himself, talking about an adolescent actually, and Efpp is well beyond adolescence, and he gave a string of advice, and the last thing he says, "Don't do anything that I've told you." So I think you're doing fine. I think the Efpp is in good hands with you, Maria, and your colleagues, and I think you don't need my advice from me. We've talked during our talk about various things that I think we're on the same wavelength about, and that so I don't think you need anything additional from me.
Well, I'm not so sure.
Yeah.
Well, Brian, thank you so much for this conversation. It's been a real pleasure. But I'd like also thank you for your generosity, for having founded this important organization with such dedication, tenacity, and rigor. Your initial impulse, your commitment to psychoanalytic psychotherapy and its great value in alleviating human suffering continues to be alive in the Efpp. My deep gratitude and that of the entire Efpp for this lesson.
Oh, well, thank you very much.
Your last word.
Well, thank you, Maria. It's been a real pleasure talking with you, and to be back in touch with the Efpp again, and to hear how satisfying it is to hear it's flourishing. And so congratulations to you and all my successors. Yeah.
Thank you. Yeah. Thank you, Brian. Have a good Christmas.
Thank you, and to you. Yeah.
Best New Year.
Yeah. Bye.
Bye.